All right, so I am like incredibly late. I finished this book like I want to say 3 weeks ago, maybe even a month ago, because I started reading it at the beginning of the school year, and now we're like a month and a half in, and I'm only now uploading it because I'm a lazy rat. And furthermore, I haven't read any other books in the meantime. So basically, I'm definitely not gonna finish before the April deadline for the bingo because there's like 25 entries and I've done three. But I will continue reading because like why not, right? So maybe I'll get through seven. Maybe I'll get through seven before April comes. At my current pace, that's what it's looking like, anyways. But yeah, the book was The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells, not the one by Ralph Emerson or no, Ralph Ellison, right? Um, yeah, it was because my friend recommended a book called The First Man in the Moon, and he said that was the best book he's ever read. So I went to the library and I was like, well, where is this book? And they didn't have The First Man in the Moon. So I checked out a different book by the same author, and it ended up being The Invisible Man. And funnily enough, it could count for the fantasy bingo. Originally I wasn't gonna count it because I didn't think there would be a cell where it fit, but it turns out it has an epilogue, and there is a cell in the bingo called Prologue and Epilogue, but you only require one of them. So this book, I was like, I've never read anything by H.G. Wells before. It's pretty old too. It's from like 1890s, and I was like, sure, why not, right? So there will be no spoilers, even though I'm gonna like kind of discuss what the epilogue was like. Well, I'm not gonna discuss the details, of course, but like generally like what it contributed to the story. So it's kind of like if I put the epilogue behind a sheet of rice paper and I started describing it and you'd hear my explanation and all that, but you'd only really have like a general outline of the thing. So yeah, no spoilers. Um but yeah, this I guess I would call it a superpower book, but it's not really in that sense because there's no the main character there's it's not a villain, nor are they a good guy. I would say that there's no main character, which is what I mean by main character is not a villain or a good guy, because there are clearly good guys and bad guys in the book, but it doesn't feel like there's a main character. It just feels like you're watching this kind of scene unfold. And that also affects the epilogue because if we look at standard epilogues in modern fantasy, which also discuss stuff like superpowers, magic systems, right? That stuff is everywhere. Um, Usually in those books, the epilogue is like a closure. Like you see the main character marries a girl, and then they have a kid, and then they're like living a good life. Like that's usually what the epilogues look like. I remember it was like that for Cradle, by Will White. So they like to give closure to the story and the main characters, which this book I would say it doesn't have. I'm not sure if like online literature nerds disagree with me. They probably do. But in general, I think the modern fantasy about like superpowers or exploration of magic, they're pretty different compared to the Invisible Man because I was like thinking about a word for this last night, and I think the best word is like they are grand. Um, and by grand, I mean that like there is world building outside of the power that you're exploring. So I guess I'll bring up Cradle again, but it's not really a good comparison. But like in Cradle, there's still this idea of the main characters exploring their forget what it was called. It's like chi or something. Whatever power they had and like all the paths and all of that of standard Shensha fantasy. They also have world building, right? Like there are these cities, there's stuff going on, right? And the Invisible Man doesn't have that, and there's no like overarching storyline, which is why I feel like it's kind of a parody because it still retains how the character is exploring their magic, right? The different uses, the issues when using it, and how it works. It's actually really grounded in that sense. For example, I don't think it counts as a spoiler, but like obviously, if you're invisible, right, your clothes are still very visible. And actually, that's part of like the science fiction of the book where they're talking about how this actually worked. He does go into detail, and I actually found that pretty interesting, irrespective of how realistic it is. Like he does go into detail about how the scientists figured this out and all of that. And like, if you're invisible, right, the clothes, it doesn't apply to clothes as well. So you will still be able to see the clothes. So in a wintry setting, either you're going to be buck naked and freezing to death, you'll have like hypothermia or whatever, or you have to cover up everything, right? So you have to cover up your eyes, your nose, your mouth. So this guy's basically like a walking bundle of clothes. And that I think that was pretty cool. And there's all these other sorts of interesting implications of invisibility as a power, as a power. So it feels very grounded in that sense, with the weaknesses and the incredible but dangerous and malicious strengths as well. Because I mean, invisibility, right? You can do so much with that. And one of the central ideas of the issues with invisibility is that he can use invisibility to maliciously get all these things he wants, whether it be money, stuff like that. But he's unable to use the money that he got because um, one thing, for example, he was robbing a guy and he got the money. Well, where is he going to hide the money? Because if he's running with the money, then you can clearly see him, right? So he can only use it to steal the money, but not reap the rewards of it. Is kind of like an idea. So it feels like a parody in that sense. And also, if we look at like in a more literary perspective, because that's just me reading too much of this like nonsense web serial fantasy, this book is actually pretty famous for being a science fiction novel, right? um, and it reflects on the nature of science fiction and how it warns against, in this case, greed corrupting science, because we learned that the person wielding the invisibility is a pretty awful guy. I mean, he does he's basically a villain in the sense of the story. He's just like not a main character. Neither is the good guy a main character, I feel. And it's a different perspective as to someone like me who just reads fantasy, because like he is one of the Wells, H.G. Wells, I mean, is one of the pioneers of science fiction. And this story does a good job of exploring the idea of a mad scientist using their powers for evil. But the epilogue in this case also humorously acknowledges other people using someone else's discoveries for bad, right? So it is, as science fiction is speculative in nature about what we could do with human technology, it does cover that aspect very well, right? Like I don't want my own perception of this book to like um, cover up all the other great groundbreaking parts about this book as it was written in the 1890s. Um, yeah, so I think if you do enjoy these kind of novels where there is like where it does have this huge impact on literature, right? It would be good for you. And personally, my favorite part is like the general storyline is um, the mad scientist in this case, but when you start the book, you don't know it yet, but you can obviously guess from how enigmatic he is. So we're in a third person perspective and we're just watching all these other people, and the invisible man in this case is like entering a hotel, and he's very mysterious and enigmatic in the sense that he's covered up in clothes, he does weird things, he's fiddling around with like chemistry because that was how the power worked in this case. But I won't spoil more of that because I actually do think it's incredibly central to the book and quite interesting to read about. And it's actually because of this frame story kind of formatting where first we're given the outside perspective where he's this super cool enigmatic guy. Well, not cool because we eventually learn he does some bad stuff, but he's very mysterious and we don't know much about him. However, um, eventually the story shifts into his perspective where we learn the backstory of how he became invisible and how it's like the greatest curse and the greatest blessing of his life. And from that perspective, we consider him to be pathetic, deplorable, right? Because like pathetic in the sense that, like I said before, the issues with invisibility are actually huge issues that stop you from actually being able to take advantage of it fully because he couldn't transform back, and also deplorable because he's obviously using these powers to do pretty horrible stuff. And actually, at the end, there's this huge climax around him being an awful person. But I think these two perspectives of how we perceive this invisibility to be super cool. I mean, that's one of the things that you want to be able to do when you're asked as a kid, like, what superpower do you want? It's like you want to fly, you want to have super strength, super smarts, or invisibility, right? And yeah, I think that frame story is an incredibly good way of portraying these perspective differences between um, how we perceive it and how it actually might end up being, which is yeah. And overall, I think it is extremely grounded, even though it is science fiction. I think um, like science fiction before, like modern science fiction with all that focus on like space and stuff like that, which I haven't read any of. I want to read stuff like the three body problem and all that, but this is basically just my own impression of modern science fiction based on like Interstellar, which is the only thing I've ever watched. Um, it's very grounded and like both in terms of being very ahead of its time, right, for literature and science fiction, plus like the implications on our society. Because for example, you could look at the internet, which he wrote way before the internet existed, and I think using the internet to do stuff like trafficking or whatever other horrible things you will see on the dark web it's pretty similar to this idea of invisibility, where it's not perfect by any means. There are definitely like there are many glaring flaws that allow us to catch these people, right? But and it has its shortcomings, but it's such a dangerous and malicious power that despite these shortcomings, these horrible things are happening, right? And that's why I like the frame story reflecting on how pathetic but also like how evil of a person he was. It's like both of these things. Usually in stories you will see like either they're very evil and very powerful and you get this imposing fear from him, which you still do in this book because the power is so strong and dangerous. But also when you look at it from his perspective, he does not like feel like a person. And like if you look at Voldemort, for example, I don't think you would consider Voldemort pathetic aside from his obsession with living forever, right? He's still like very imposing character in that sense. Yeah, but I feel like this invisibility and the internet, they're kind of similar, and you could make many more like corollaries or observations about modern day technologies that people could be using to do bad things, as well as the Invisible Man. So definitely read it if you're like into this whole idea. But like on a less serious note, I also generally think that reading the parts about how he um, discovered the science behind it and like the theory, although like obviously just as with modern magic or power exploring novels, right, where the main character is exploring this sort of magic, like they're discovering it and they're pioneering it or whatever. Um, it's still very fun. Like that, reading about that stuff is still very cool, and it's also ahead of its time in this way because, I mean, back then nobody was writing novels like that, right? So it's just missing the self-insert part, which you would see in the modern isekais and stuff, but it still has a lot of that cool exploration of power, which I think is very interesting. Like yeah, I think like I would talk about it more, but I think reading all the details is like part of the experience itself. So I don't want to go into it further. This is just basically just me being lazy for like not having a true script for this. So just take with that what you will. But yeah, that's on a less serious note. I generally think that part is an enjoyable read if you are into these kinds of modern web serials, I guess. So yeah, great book, 8 out of 10.